Some crimes do not drown beneath the tide. They drift, waiting to be found again. It begins on the mist-choked wharves of London, where a sailor vanishes, a widow wears another's name, and the sea itself seems to whisper of guilt that will not sink. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The river remembers, even when men forget. Let's follow the ripples back to where the truth first surfaced. There are nights in London when the fog does not merely roll, it breathes. It curls along the riverbanks as if drawn by the slow, deliberate pulse of the Thames itself. I have often thought of that river as both a giver and a taker, the great artery of commerce and the grave of too many nameless souls. It was on such a night, dense with mist and melancholy, that I found Sherlock Holmes standing at our window, his silhouette sharp against the dim light of Baker Street. The lamplight below swam like dying stars through the haze, and in that glow I saw his eyes fixed on some invisible point in thought. "Watson," he murmured, "have you ever considered that the river remembers?" Before I could answer, Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of a visitor, a young lady, trembling and dressed in a shade of green that reminded me of sea glass under clouded water. The lady who entered was pale, not with illness, but with the exhaustion of worry carried too long. Her gloves were damp, her veil drawn low, and her voice faltered when she gave her name, Miss Eleanor Harwood. Holmes, who had taken his seat, motioned for her to proceed. "It concerns my brother, Mr. Holmes," she began. "He was a sailor, Reuben Harwood. He docked in London 4 nights ago and sent a message that he would call upon me by morning. He never arrived." She spoke not with hysteria, but with a calmness more unsettling, the calm of one who has already imagined every possible horror. Watson, ever the gentleman, offered her a chair and tea, but she shook her head. "They found his coat," she whispered. "That is all." Holmes leaned forward. "Found, you say? Where?" "By the river's edge, near the Grimsby wharf, torn, wet, and stained." The word hung in the air, fragile and dreadful. Holmes requested to see the garment, and from a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth, Miss Harwood revealed it. Even now, I recall the faint smell of brine and decay that filled the room. It was a sailor's coat indeed, thick, weather-beaten, and stiffened by salt. But the irregular dark stains upon its sleeve drew Holmes's attention immediately. He bent close, his fingers tracing the pattern with surgical precision. "This coat," he said, "has seen a recent struggle. Note the tearing along the seam, the salt not yet crystallized, and," his voice lowered, "blood, but not soaked through. Someone bled here, but not fatally." Miss Harwood clasped her gloved hands. "You think my brother is alive?" Holmes did not answer her directly. Instead, he asked where the discovery had been made and who had found it. Her account was hesitant, the name of a dockhand, a fog-shrouded hour, a policeman who dismissed it as an accident of the tide. Holmes's expression hardened. "The tide, Miss Harwood, may conceal, but it never lies. I must see this place." When the lady departed, leaving the coat behind, Holmes stood long in silence. "Watson," he said at last, "there is something not wholly candid in Miss Harwood's narrative. Her distress was genuine, yet her phrasing and peculiar. Did you note that she said, 'They found his coat,' not the police or a man? She distances herself from the source." "You suspect deception?" I asked. "Perhaps omission," he replied. "The most dangerous kind." Holmes then examined the inner lining of the coat, producing from one pocket a small scrap of paper, brittle, folded, and water-stained. Upon it were the faint letters BQ and a date, October 17th. "Barrow Queen," Holmes murmured. "A merchant ship moored 2 days before Reuben's disappearance." His eyes gleamed in that way they often did when his mind found its thread. "Watson, the river calls. Fetch your coat." By the time we reached Grimsby Wharf, the mist had thickened into something almost tangible. The gas lamps cast trembling halos that faded a few feet into the murk. The docks were nearly deserted, save for the creak of mooring ropes and the whisper of unseen water. Holmes moved with purpose, his lantern sweeping over the boards, his gaze darting from plank to puddle, like a hawk tracing the ground for prey. "This place reeks of fear," he muttered, kneeling beside a patch of discoloured timber. "Here, Watson, note the indentation. A boot mark, narrow-toed, not the common dockworkers. And beside it, drag lines." Something heavy pulled toward the water. We followed the faint trail until it disappeared at the pier's edge. Holmes held the lantern low, revealing small flecks of dried crimson clinging to the wood grain. Then he turned his gaze upward, toward the river. The tide took something, or someone, away from here. He remained still for several seconds, the wind tugging at his coat. "Do you feel it, Watson? The river does not grieve, it consumes." Back at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. He compared the stains from the oilskin to a small vial of reagent from his chemical table. The reaction was faint, far fainter than one would expect. He leaned over the flame, eyes narrowing in triumph and dread. "This," he said quietly, "is not Reuben Harwood's blood." I started. "Then whose?" "Someone else's. The blood type differs entirely. Our missing sailor may not be the victim, Watson. He may be the cause." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then Holmes turned toward the fogged window once more. "A river that swallows men," he murmured, echoing my earlier thought. But perhaps this time, Watson, the river spat one back, changed beyond recognition. And as the wind moaned faintly through the chimney, I knew the case had only begun. The following morning found Holmes and me walking the long and silent path toward the Thames. Though day had broken, the harbour remained cloaked in a kind of spectral hush, the sort that seemed not merely the result of fog, but of something older, embedded in the wood and stone, the very salt of the tide. It was a silence that no seagull pierced, no rope creaked through. The wharf was near deserted, save for the rare glances of men who would not meet our eyes. I have seen many faces in times of fear, but these bore not the tremble of a recent crime, rather the expression of men who carry old secrets and have learned never to speak them. Holmes walked without comment, his sharp gaze darting from hull to hook, from waterline to winch. He seemed less a man of flesh than a blade of intellect honed by purpose. When he finally paused, it was not at the place where Reuben's coat had been found, but before a vessel that loomed like a scar in the mist, the Barrow Queen. "The sea forgets nothing, Watson," he murmured. "It simply buries the evidence deeper." We were received aboard with marked reluctance. A deckhand with broken teeth and bitter eyes admitted us with a muttered curse I could not make out. The boards creaked beneath our feet with the fatigue of years, and the ship exhaled a heavy odour, rust, sweat, and brine. The crew was a hard lot. They kept to their tasks, eyes averted, as if the presence of outsiders on the deck risked awakening something long put to rest. Holmes introduced himself plainly, adding only that we sought information regarding a crewman named Reuben Harwood. The reaction was palpable. No word was spoken, but one man's grip on the rigging tightened until his knuckles whitened. Another turned his back altogether. "Mr. Harwood left the ship as expected," said a voice, dry as salt-crackled timber. It belonged to a man near the helm, his oilskin collar raised, his face half in shadow. Holmes turned to him. "And yet his coat was found bloodied and torn not 50 yards from here." "I can't speak to what the river chooses to hold or to give," the man replied. "Then perhaps your captain can." Captain Whitmer was a relic of the sort rarely found outside of yellowed maritime court records. A figure with a face like weathered canvas, stitched together by time and tobacco. His eyes were red-rimmed, though not merely from drink. There was fear in them too, buried beneath a mask of command. He did not rise when we entered his cabin, but sat hunched over a logbook that appeared not to have been opened in weeks. Holmes stood silent, letting the quiet pressure do its work. "I've nothing to add," Whitmer said at last, staring into his empty cup. Harwood was restless. Some men are like that. They come aboard with the sea in their blood, but rot from within. He disembarked at dock. We saw him go. No one saw him reach the street, Holmes said softly. "And the coat?" Whitmer's eyes flicked toward the wall, then back. "You've no proof of anything, Mr. Holmes. The man had enemies." "Enemies aboard?" Holmes asked. A silence. The captain's hand trembled as he reached for his rum. "Ask Morris. He logs the comings and goings." "Ah," Holmes said, barely above a whisper. "But I believe it is what Mr. Morris does not log that matters." We found Dock Inspector Morris in a weather-stained booth at the harbour's edge. He greeted us with the officious smile of a man whose authority is more coat than conviction. "I handle intake and departure," he said briskly. "The Barrow Queen cleared customs. Your man left the ship. What he did afterward is no longer my concern." Holmes studied him without blinking. "And if he never left at all?" Morris's mouth tightened. "Then he's dead in the water, isn't he? But I've seen no body, nor have the police." "There was blood, Inspector," I offered, "and silence." "Blood's common here," Morris replied. As for silence, well, perhaps he was never worth speaking of. Holmes's gaze narrowed. "I find your detachment curious, Mr. Morris. You seem to have formed rather a strong opinion about a man whose fate you profess to ignore." Morris met his stare with forced composure. "I follow regulations." Holmes stepped closer. "And regulations, I imagine, are quite useful when one wishes to conceal what lies just beyond them." The inspector said nothing. Holmes turned to me as we departed. "That man, Watson," he said in a low voice, "knows far too much to be uninvolved, and far too little to be innocent." The interior of the Barrow Queen was a coffin of sound. Beneath the creak of the deck and the lap of waves against her hull, one could almost hear the memory of voices, laughter, curses, prayers, all extinguished and preserved by salt and time. The narrow passage smelt of iron and tar. As Holmes questioned the quartermaster above, I descended alone, lantern in hand, compelled by a faint noise, the shuffle of feet where no feet should have been. There, crouched beside a stack of coiled rope, was a boy, no older than 16, thin, pale, and wide-eyed. His cap hung loose on his head, his hands trembling as if the cold itself had seized him. "Samuel Pike?" I asked gently. "Your captain mentioned you." He nodded but did not meet my gaze. "I shouldn't talk to you, sir. He says it brings bad luck." "Who says that?" "The one who comes after dark." The words sent a chill through me. "After dark? You mean someone comes aboard?" He hesitated, then leaned forward. "Not someone we know, sir. A man, or something that looks like one. Always after docking, never when the captain's watching. We hear him on the planks, walking slow, like he's counting steps." "And you've seen him?" Samuel nodded again, his voice a whisper. "The last night Mr. Harwood was here, he said to me, 'If you see him again, don't be afraid. He's come for me, not for you.'" The lantern flickered, and for a moment the boy's shadow stretched long and thin along the boards, shivering with the sway of the ship. I felt the old pulse of unease that comes when the mind, reasoning still, feels the edge of something it cannot explain. I rose and turned toward the ladderway, my voice low. "Holmes will want to hear this." But before I could ascend, the boy caught my sleeve. His voice cracked like breaking glass. "He said his name wasn't Reuben, sir. Not really. He said the sea took the first one." Holmes listened in silence as I repeated the boy's account. We stood upon the dock again, the fog closing in like a living thing, muffling the world until even our breath seemed stolen by it. When I finished, he gave a single nod, his expression unreadable. "The sea took the first one," he murmured. "Watson, how often a man must die before he can live again, and how seldom he succeeds in the attempt." He motioned for me to follow him to a small office near the harbour's edge. The Records Bureau, dimly lit and smelling of mildew. With characteristic economy of movement, he turned the registry books with swift, precise hands. Reuben Harwood, he said, scanning the columns. Born Bristol, sailor aboard the Albatross, drowned at sea 5 years ago. He tapped the line with his forefinger. Declared dead by the Admiralty. I stared. Then the man who called himself Reuben Harwood is an impostor or a revenant, Holmes said softly. And as the latter is improbable, we must assume the former. He closed the book, eyes gleaming in that cold fire I had come to recognize. But that boy's story gives us something more. A phantom visitor, a ship that reeks of silence, and a man who lived once, died once, and returned under another name. These, Watson, are not fragments. They are coordinates. Outside, the fog thickened. The faint toll of a bell drifted from some unseen buoy, slow, mournful, unrelenting. Holmes turned toward the river. If he truly survived what no man should, then somewhere in that survival lies the reason for his second death. He drew the oilskin coat tighter about him, the same one we had brought from Baker Street, the one whose blood had defied explanation. Tell me, Watson, he said at last, have you ever noticed how the sea forgives no deception, even the kind meant to cheat death? I could find no reply. Somewhere beyond the grey veil, a ship's horn bellowed, long, hollow, and sorrowful. It seemed less a sound than a warning. And as we turned back toward the mist-bound docks, I could not shake the dreadful conviction that the sea, in its cold indifference, was listening still. The following day was a bitter one, heavy with rain that blurred the outlines of London into a city of shadows. The downpour tapped against our windows like a restless hand, and Holmes, seated cross-legged upon the settee, seemed scarcely aware of it. He had spent the entire morning buried among a heap of maritime records, letters, and clippings brought from the registry. At last he spoke, softly, as if thinking aloud rather than addressing me. There is no man named Reuben Harwood, Watson, not one born nor buried under that name, save a sailor who died and was interred at Bristol 3 years ago, and yet the gentleman who bore it lived and breathed until last week. I looked up from my chair. Then who was he? Holmes's eyes gleamed beneath the shadow of his brow. A ghost of circumstance. A man who borrowed another's name, perhaps to outrun his past. But the river, as I have long observed, has a cruel habit of washing secrets ashore. He rose, the papers rustling in his hand. We are not seeking a missing sailor, Watson. We are pursuing a resurrection. His words, spoken so calmly, struck me with the chill of revelation. For in that instant, I understood that we had crossed from the realm of the criminal into the realm of the damned, where guilt and survival are but two faces of the same coin. Our investigation took us next to the Admiralty Archives, a cavernous place that smelled of old ink and salt-stained paper. Holmes moved through the shelves like a man seeking the ghost of an idea. Within the hour, his fingers stopped upon a faded newspaper clipping pressed between two reports. It told of a mutiny aboard a merchant vessel, the Albatross, 5 years past. The article, yellowed by time, detailed a night of fire, panic, and betrayal. The ship, it said, went down off the coast of Madeira, leaving few alive to tell the tale. Among the accused had been one Julian Harrow, charged with inciting rebellion against his captain. The case was dropped when the ship itself sank, taking the evidence with it. Holmes's voice cut through the silence. Julian Harrow, the name is close enough in sound to be mistaken for Harwood by a lazy ear, and by a guilty conscience. I leaned over his shoulder, reading the final lines. 2 survivors are said to have escaped in a lifeboat, names undisclosed. The bodies of the others were never recovered. Holmes folded the clipping neatly. It seems our Reuben did not die in the sea as the world believed. He merely shed his skin and took another's life to shore. He turned to me with quiet intensity. And Watson, what becomes of a man who must live every day beneath the name of one already dead? I could find no answer. The question lingered, like the echo of waves against a coffin's lid. The hours that followed were drenched in that peculiar stillness which comes only when one stands too close to an ugly truth. Holmes sat by the fire, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the flickering light carving strange shadows across his face. "There were 2 survivors," he said at last. "2 men pulled from the wreckage, but the record's name only one." I frowned. "And the other?" He slid a document toward me. It was a report from the Maritime Board, lines struck through in heavy ink, the second man's name carefully redacted. "This," Holmes continued, "is no clerical oversight. Someone ensured that the survivor's identity would vanish beneath bureaucracy. The question, therefore, is simple. Who had the power to erase him, and the motive to do so?" I felt a strange unease, as though we had stepped into the shadow of something vaster than murder. Holmes's tone darkened. "Consider, Watson, a man who escapes death by allowing his comrades to drown. He returns, cloaked in another's name, living a life borrowed from the grave. How long before guilt calls him back to the water?" His eyes met mine across the room, sharp, haunted, almost human. "And perhaps, my dear fellow, someone else survived too. Someone who remembers." The fire hissed softly, as though in agreement. That evening, Miss Eleanor Harwood called again, or rather, the woman who had taken that name. Her composure, so carefully held before, seemed strained now. There were lines upon her face that no candlelight could soften. Holmes greeted her with a politeness that felt almost cruel. "You told us, madam, that your brother last wrote from his ship a fortnight ago, yet I find records of his discharge 2 days earlier. Were you misinformed, or misleading?" Her lips trembled. "You have no right—" "On the contrary," Holmes interrupted, "truth is a right owed to the dead, if not to the living." She faltered, then sank into her chair, eyes glistening with tears. "I thought if I told you everything, you would not help me. I feared you would stop searching. I only wanted to know what became of him." "Indeed," Holmes said softly, "and perhaps, too, what became of your conscience." She looked up sharply, a flicker of indignation flashing through her grief. Holmes's gaze did not waver. As she left, I could not help but pity her. "You are harsh, Holmes," I said. He turned toward the window, his profile cut against the dim light of the street lamps. "Grief, Watson, is a curious mask. It hides not only sorrow, but design, and behind her tears lies purpose. Cold, deliberate purpose." Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like the sea itself, and I thought of the words Holmes had spoken earlier. 2 survivors. I began to wonder, not for the first time, whether the dead of the Albatross were the lucky ones. It was nearing dusk when the knock came at the door. Not the sharp rap of an impatient caller, but the hesitant tap of someone who wishes to arrive and disappear, in the same moment. I opened it to find a boy no older than 12, his coat too thin for the chill, his face turned from mine. He handed me a small parcel, wrapped in twine and stiff with damp, then fled without a word. I brought it to Holmes, who sat by the fire with his violin in hand, though he had not played a note in over an hour. The string he held dangled listlessly, unstruck. He glanced up and wordlessly gestured for the package. With care, he undid the twine. The smell of the sea rose from it, briny, bitter, unmistakable. Inside lay a single folded page, curled at the edges, its ink blurred by salt and time. A page torn from a logbook, no doubt of it. Holmes unfolded it slowly. Across its surface were rows of neat handwriting in naval script, most of it unreadable, save for one line, scrawled in a darker hand, thick and uneven as if written in haste by a man who could barely hold the pen. He was never meant to return. Holmes held the parchment between thumb and forefinger, studying the frayed fibres where it had been ripped free. A message, he murmured, but not merely for us. This was meant for him, for Harrow, for the man who wore another name like a skin. And yet now it is we who hold it. He rose, eyes distant. There is no murder without motive, Watson, and no message without memory. Holmes did not speak again until the fire had begun to die, casting long, soft shadows across the floor of Baker Street. He stood with the page still in hand, the flames licking its edge, but never quite consuming it. "Consider the phrasing," he said finally. "He was never meant to return. It implies not warning but judgment, not accident but sentence." I leaned forward. "You believe this is not merely a killing, then?" He turned to me. "No, Watson, this is not a murder. It is a reckoning." The fire cracked, and for a long moment, neither of us moved. The air felt thick, as though the house itself had begun to listen. Holmes crossed to the mantel and placed the page gently on the coals. It curled, blackened, and vanished in a flutter of ash. He watched it with an intensity that made my breath still. I have seen men kill for money, for passion, for fear. But this... He trailed off. Then, slowly, "There are crimes that are not written in the law books, Watson. Crimes of survival, of silence, of letting others perish so that one might see another dawn." He turned from the hearth and poured himself a measure of brandy, though I knew he would not drink it. Julian Harrow, or Reuben Harwood, if one prefers the fiction, was no saint. He escaped the grave not by chance, but by choice. He survived the albatross because others did not. I stared at him. "You believe he let them die?" "I believe," Holmes said coldly, "that he closed a hatch and sealed it behind him." The thought made me shiver. "And the second survivor?" Holmes met my gaze. "Is not a murderer. Watson, he is an executioner." Outside, the wind rose, whistling through the gaps in the window pane. The sound was low, hollow, and mournful, like the last breath of a sinking ship. And I, sitting beside the fire with the embers fading to grey, knew that we had stumbled into something deeper than blood and guilt. We had stepped into the shadow of an unpunished sin, and someone, somewhere, had come to collect its price. The fog had thickened once more, a livid wall of white that wrapped the wharf like a winding sheet. Somewhere beyond its veil, the Thames moved with its ceaseless breath, hiding sins, ferrying ghosts. It was Holmes's idea, of course. The trap. A man dressed in the oilskin coat of Reuben Harwood, shoulders hunched, gait rehearsed to mimic the sailor's familiar limp, now paced the same stretch of dock from which the real man had vanished. We watched from behind a stack of barrels, silent and still, our breath tight against the cold. Holmes whispered beside me, "Men who live with hatred do not forget. They wait, sometimes years, but they wait." Time passed. The decoy paced once, twice. Then we saw him, a shadow unmoored from the mist. A figure stepped forth as if from the river itself, silent, determined, half-formed in the gaslight, and in his hand, a glint. Holmes moved first, swift as a coiled spring. I followed. The man lunged toward the decoy with blade drawn, but Holmes had already seized his arm at the wrist. The figure twisted, hissed, and stumbled backward into my reach. Together we dragged him into the light. It was Inspector Morris. Only now he looked nothing like the officious bureaucrat we had met before. His hair was dishevelled, his breath foul with gin and fury, and his eyes, how they burned with something ancient and unspent. Holmes stared down at him with no expression at all. "Ah," he said coldly, the man who saw everything and reported nothing. The weapon, a rusted marlinspike, sharpened to a point, clattered to the ground as Morris fell to his knees. His chest heaved, and his eyes darted not toward us, but toward the fog, as if hoping something in it would reclaim him, as if the river itself might come to his defense. It was supposed to be him, he croaked. Only him. Holmes crouched before him, his voice low, calm, unhurried. You've waited a long time, haven't you, Mr. Morris? Morris's reply was a laugh, ragged, cracked, and full of venom. I served with him, the albatross. I was there. Holmes said nothing. He let them die, Morris spat. He sealed the hold, claimed there was water breaching, lied. I saw it. He saved himself and sealed the rest in with a prayer and a latch. Holmes's voice remained steady. And you survived? Barely, Morris said. A lifeboat. He found me half dead and dragged me ashore. Said I owed him my life. His lips twisted. But all I owed him was silence, until I heard he'd come back, as Reuben Harwood. His head dropped. He had no right. I watched him in stunned silence. Here was a man destroyed not by death, but by survival, by the memory of betrayal, salted by years of enforced civility, until at last the wound had festered into vengeance. Holmes rose slowly, eyes unreadable. You were not seeking justice, Mr. Morris. You were exacting judgment. We brought Morris to Baker Street that night, not as a prisoner, but as a man unburdened, though the burden had not lifted from him so much as passed to us. He sat at the edge of his chair like a man awaiting execution, yet strangely relieved. I was his first mate, he said again, more quietly now. Back then, on the albatross. Holmes, seated opposite, rested his fingers together. Tell us. Tell it all. Morris drew in a shuddering breath. There was a fire. It started near the galley. We thought it accidental, but the crew, they panicked. Smoke below, engine out. Some ran for the boats, some fought. We took on water fast. Reuben, Julian, went below. Said he'd check the valves. He looked up, but he didn't. He locked the hatch from outside. I saw him. The rest, they pounded, they screamed, and then they stopped. And you? Holmes asked. I was above deck, injured. He pulled me to the boat. Said there was no time, that they were already gone. Morris paused. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Until the dream started. He lowered his gaze. You don't hear things like that and forget. And then, when I saw him again, the name changed, the life polished. All I could hear was the sound of fists on steel. Silence filled the room. Holmes rose at last, his expression unchanged, though something in his voice trembled with restraint. Guilt does not sleep, Mr. Morris, nor does it drown. It floats, just below the surface. Morris stood slowly, eyes hollow. Then I'll sink with it. No, Holmes replied coldly. You'll walk beside it, for that is the true sentence. As we watched him disappear into the fog outside our door, I turned to Holmes and whispered, What will become of him? Holmes did not look away from the window. Nothing the law can offer, he said, but everything the river can remember. Holmes stood by the hearth as Morris spoke, his figure still as iron, and his gaze fixed not on the man before him, but on some darker place behind his own eyes. As though the tale were unfolding there again, line by line, scream by scream. Morris's voice had quieted. The venom had drained from it, leaving only memory, brittle, bitter, and unmistakably true. There was a fire, he said, but it didn't matter. It was the water that killed them. The bulkhead had collapsed. The forward hold was flooding fast. The engine was dead. We had minutes, maybe less. His breath caught. He knew, Morris whispered. He knew. He shouted that he was going below to shut the valves, to save them. But he didn't. He went down there and closed the hatch from the outside. I saw him, Holmes. I saw him lock it, and then he ran. Holmes's voice was calm, almost kind. You were injured? Crushed ribs, smoke in the lungs. I couldn't move. He dragged me to the lifeboat, shoved me in like a sack, never said a word. We drifted for 2 days. He looked at us both, eyes hollow. He was quiet, never cried, never prayed, just stared at the horizon. I thought it was shock. It wasn't. It was shame. Holmes replied, barely above a whisper. A man who survives betrayal of that kind, and survives because of it, must carry two burdens. One is guilt, the other is fear that someone else remembers. And someone did. Morris exhaled and let the silence settle like dust. When he spoke again, it was not with confession, but calculation. I waited, Mr. Holmes, not for justice, for timing, for him to rise again, and for the tide to turn. And when did you learn of his new name? Holmes asked quietly. 2 years ago, a passing mention from a customs officer, Reuben Harwood. A quiet man, kept to himself, fit the pattern. I made inquiries. And you never confronted him? I asked. Morris shook his head. He would have run, disappeared again. No, I wanted more. I wanted to pull the past over his head like a shroud. Holmes tilted his head slightly. And Eleanor? She came later, Morris said. After I'd traced the name to London. She arrived asking about a man. Her brother, she claimed. But I saw through it. Too much anger in her questions. Too much grief in her pauses. He leaned forward now, hands clenched. She told me her husband had died aboard the Albatross. One of those locked below. I didn't need to say a word. She knew. You forged the telegram? Holmes asked. She did, Morris corrected. But I knew of it. I said nothing. That was my pact. Let him come back to the docks. Let him step into the grave he escaped. And the coat? I asked. Morris glanced at the fire. Salted, stained, left like a lure. Holmes said nothing, and for the first time I realized that this case had not been built on lies, but on truths preserved in silence, sharpened in waiting, and released like a trap when the moment demanded it. Holmes confronted Eleanor not with accusation, but with calm inevitability. We found her in her modest flat near Wapping, seated by the window as though she had known he would come. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her expression was unreadable. Not shame, not triumph. Something quieter, something sadder. You're not his sister, Holmes said simply. No, she replied. Your name is not Harwood. No. You were married to William Annesley, carpenter's mate aboard the Albatross. One of the men sealed in that hold. She blinked once but did not flinch. I was 19 when he went to sea, 20 when they said he was gone, 25 when I learned the truth. Holmes studied her. You traced him from memory alone? Memory, she said softly, and rage. And so, Holmes continued, you became the grieving sister, armed with only a coat and a name. You summoned me not to find him, but to expose him. You knew he would vanish again unless someone like me gave chase. A pause. She looked at him, her voice trembling only slightly. I wanted the world to know, not the police, not the courts, the truth. I wanted someone like you to see it, to say it aloud. Holmes stepped forward gently. And what if Morris had killed him? Her voice broke. Then it would have been finished. I felt the chill that comes not with guilt, but with the knowledge that something irreparably human had been fractured. Holmes, always so firm in his moral clarity, was silent for a long moment. Then he said, There are crimes born of cruelty, Mrs. Annesley, and crimes born of memory. Only the former are mine to judge. She nodded once, and as we stepped back into the night, I could not help but think of the Albatross, a ship lost not only to water, but to time, and of the people who had never stopped hearing it scream. It was just after 6 o'clock, and the last of the rain still clung to the panes when Holmes turned upon Eleanor with the force of inevitability. The sitting room in which we had gathered at Mrs. Langton's boarding house bore the faint scent of damp wool and coal smoke. A fitting chamber, I thought, for confessions long delayed. Miss Langton, Holmes began, though his voice was quieter than usual. You have brought us all this way, not for justice, but for memory. Let us not confuse the two." She looked at him then, not with fear, but the exhaustion of someone who had finally ceased swimming against a tide. Her hands, gloved still, trembled slightly upon her lap. "Yes," she said. "It was I. I sent the telegram, the one that brought Reuben back. You forged the name of a shipmate, a man long drowned," Holmes replied, glancing at the folded page in his hand, "and gave it just enough authenticity to provoke a sailor's caution. I had to," she said, her voice catching. "Reuben would not have returned otherwise, and I needed him back, needed him to look at me, to see the wreck he had left." There was no malice in her tone, only something far older, the sediment of bitterness settled at the bottom of grief. I found myself unexpectedly moved, and Holmes too was silent for a time. "It was not hatred," she said softly, "only unfinished mourning." And so, the lie was confessed. But the truth, as Holmes often remarked, was never so simple as ink upon paper. We listened as Eleanor's voice took on the rhythm of memory, uneven and reluctant, like a tide receding over stone. "I followed him," she said. "He never knew. I watched him from the street as he boarded the Barrow Queen that night. He looked older than I remembered. The sea had carved lines into him." She paused, then continued, her hands now clenched into fists. "I waited near the dock gates, but Reuben never came back. I saw Morris later. His coat was wet, his hands red with the cold, or something else." Holmes leaned forward. "And what did you do then?" "I went aboard the next day, pretending to deliver a package. There were signs, a torn strap near the aft cabin, a drop of blood beneath the hatch rail. I knew then." "Morris made sure the tide carried him out before dawn," Holmes said grimly, "and with no crew on shift until morning, no one to speak for Reuben. A ship with no witnesses." Eleanor nodded. "He chose the moment carefully. Reuben was silenced before he could speak of what he saw aboard the Albatross. That was always the fear, you see. Not the crime itself, but the memory of it returning like a phantom tide." Her voice faltered, but her gaze remained steady. Holmes stood and walked to the window. The docks were lost in mist beyond, and I could see his silhouette, sharp and still. "One sailor gone," he murmured, "and another condemned to silence. It is always the quiet men who carry the heaviest cargo." As Holmes turned from the window, his expression shifted, not with surprise, but with understanding long overdue. "It was you who placed the coat," he said, not as accusation, but as deduction rendered inevitable. "The oilskin draped on the hook outside the warehouse, a sailor's coat, worn and torn, left in the only place I could not help but find it." Eleanor's breath caught. "Yes, I needed you there. I needed someone who could make the truth walk again." I looked between them, slowly grasping the quiet brilliance of her act. The coat, which we had taken for evidence left behind in haste, had been a signal. A flare fired into the fog. "There are those," she said, "who live after murder. And then there are those who live with it. I thought if anyone could see through the fog, it would be him." Holmes studied her with a curious detachment, as though she were a specimen not yet named. "And so, you baited the hook with memory, knowing that if I arrived, I would follow the scent, not of blood, but of guilt." "Yes," she whispered, "because the sea forgets, but men do not." There was a long silence. Then Holmes, in a voice almost tender, said, "You have summoned justice, Miss Langton, not by force, but by ghostlight, a clever trick and a costly one." And with that, he turned to the hearth where the embers glowed, the last of the rain hissing gently against the glass. The past, it seemed, would not sink after all. There was a peculiar stillness in the air as Eleanor finished. Holmes had not once interrupted her recitation, nor did he move when her voice faltered. His eyes remained trained on the dark slats of the floorboards beneath our feet, though his mind was clearly adrift in deeper waters. It was not revenge. she murmured, her fingers knotted tightly around her handkerchief. I only wanted to know if he had screamed, if the sea had heard him. Holmes finally rose from the high-backed chair and walked, hands clasped behind him, to the low hearth where the coals had long since died. The scent of salt and old smoke lingered in the walls. "You forged a government telegram," he said, not cruelly, but with the deliberate weight of precision. "Tampered with naval records, misled a government agent, and you exposed a man to a peril not your own to decide." She nodded without defense. "And yet," he continued, his voice lower now, "you did not do so for money, nor even justice. You did it because the truth is the only thing you believed you had left." Eleanor raised her head then, her eyes hollow but resolute. "Reuben believed in the ledger, in the truth it held. If I let it rot in some locked drawer, what part of him would have remained?" Holmes gave the smallest incline of his head. "Memory," he said, "is a kind of vengeance. Some inflict it, others live beneath it." He turned to me then. "Come, Watson, the tide is rising, and there is nothing more to keep us here." We left without another word. She did not follow. The morning tide had begun its silent crawl across the stones of the quay when we emerged from the cottage and stepped into the pale mist. The air was damp with sleep, and the harbour seemed to breathe in long, sorrowful draughts. Holmes walked ahead, his coat drawn close, while I lingered a step behind, casting one last glance toward the sagging shutters of Eleanor's dwelling. We passed the derelict skeleton of the Barrow Queen, now bound in rust and ropes, her sails long since stripped. The magistrate had ordered her impounded. Word was she would be quietly sold to a Welsh scrapyard. Her secrets would travel no farther. Down the wharf, just before the jetty vanished into fog, I paused. A boy, no more than 8, sat cross-legged by a puddle, a blunt knife in hand. He worked slowly, deliberately, etching letters into the side of a small wooden toy boat. I watched in silence as he carved REUBEN. Without looking up, the boy walked to the edge, crouched, and placed the vessel on the water. A breath of wind stirred the mist. The little boat bobbed twice, then glided into the shrouded inlet, vanishing as though it had never been. There was no sound but the distant creak of mooring lines. I do not know if the child had known Reuben or merely heard his name whispered through salt-worn lips. But in that moment, I felt a peculiar ache, not of grief, but of something older, deeper. Holmes called gently behind me, and I turned. The sea had taken another offering, and this one, perhaps, it would keep. There are certain cases, fewer than one might suppose, in which the gavel of the magistrate falls with a sense of satisfying finality. More often, the justice that Holmes pursues ends not in the clang of iron bars, but in silences, long, brooding silences that stretch between men and memory. The case of the Barrow Queen, as I have come to call it in my own recollections, concluded not with the thunderclap of revelation, but with something far more haunting, a slow ebbing away, like the tide drawing secrets back into the sea. Holmes had spoken little in the days that followed. He had not summoned Lestrade nor celebrated deduction. Instead, he sat by the hearth in Baker Street, gazing into the fire with a stare that seemed fixed on something far beyond the reach of any logbook or testimony. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he remarked at last, "how some crimes leave no bloodstain, no fingerprint, no legal footprint, and yet they weigh more heavily than murder." I could not disagree. There was a quiet in me also, a space filled by the faces of those who remained and of those who vanished. The case had ended, but the echo of it would linger in our thoughts, unanswered, unresolved. And as with all such echoes, it was not the absence of sound that disturbed, but the knowledge that something had called, and no one had replied. Some weeks later, I stood with Holmes along the wharf at Wapping, both of us silent as the vessel at the centre of our inquiries loomed before us, for the final time. The Barrow Queen, rusting and scoured by wind, had been impounded under orders of the Maritime Board. Its masts had been cut, its rigging undone. Dock workers moved about like silent pallbearers, removing her fittings as one might strip the garments from a body prepared for burial. The name, once painted in proud serif across the bow, had been smeared with lead grey. A new designation would soon be inscribed, for the vessel had been sold to a Scandinavian merchant fleet, its history lost, beneath the lacquer of commercial necessity. But we knew. And the salt on the wind that day seemed to whisper that the sea remembered as well. Holmes did not speak as he watched the hull being scraped clean. Only when a particularly stubborn bolt gave way with a metallic shriek did he murmur, "There are stories, Watson, that do not wish to be buried, and yet men insist on nailing shut the coffins of their own shame." I looked at him and found in his profile a weariness rare in the man, a weariness not born of exertion, but of knowledge. He turned and began to walk back along the pier. The Barrow Queen would sail no more, but it had already left in its wake a wreckage that no dry dock could ever mend. In the courtroom of Suffolk Crown, Dock Inspector Henry Morris stood before the bench with the indignation of a man convinced that his misdeeds had never truly been crimes. The charges read out to him: obstruction of justice, falsification of records, and dereliction of duty, seemed to his mind bureaucratic inconveniences rather than ethical failures. Yet the evidence was inarguable. Holmes had placed before the court the doctored log sheets, the conveniently altered shipping manifests, and the curious gaps in inspection reports that coincided too neatly with the Barrow Queen's most clandestine voyages. There was no murder charge, no mention of drowning sailors or sunken names. For in truth, Morris had not killed, but he had cleared the path for someone who did. And so the law, blind in one eye, reached out with the other and dragged him into its grasp. Holmes did not attend the sentencing. "Justice," he said, "is a ship that lists to one side, but even when it leaks, it sails." I sat through the proceedings alone, watching the man who had smirked in our presence now wilt under the weight of public shame. When the sentence was passed, 18 months in prison, I could not help but feel that it was neither enough nor entirely misplaced. There are tides that cleanse, but some merely push the filth into another corner of the shore. Eleanor Harwood did not wait to be questioned, nor did she resist. In truth, there had never been a charge, only suspicion and the dreadful weight of what Holmes had concluded in silence. Her motive had not been greed nor spite, but something harder to judge. A mourning so deep it sought not revenge, but truth, however terrible that truth proved to be. 2 days after the ship was sold, she vanished. Her modest flat in Battersea was found stripped of all possessions, save for a piano key wrapped in silk and a sealed envelope addressed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, left upon the mantel. He did not open it. For hours it lay on our table, the wax unbroken. I watched Holmes study it with the intensity of a man reading a confession without needing the words. At last, he reached into the fire with a pair of tongs and placed the envelope directly upon the coals. "There are truths, Watson," he said softly, "that owe us nothing." And thus, Eleanor Harwood disappeared from London, from our records, and from the reach of justice. Whether she boarded a steamer to New York or walked into the Thames, we never discovered. But in her absence, she left a silence that said more than guilt, and a gesture that Holmes would never forget. That night, as the wind howled against the windows of Baker Street, Holmes retrieved the sailor's logbook from its hiding place within his desk. The page in question, the one that had started it all, with its half-erased name and cryptic marking, was torn from the binding with surgical precision. He examined it once more, held it to the light, and with a faint narrowing of the eyes, lowered it gently into the fireplace. The flame caught with surprising haste. The parchment curled, blackened, and disintegrated in a rising plume of grey. Holmes watched it vanish, his expression unreadable. "Paper burns," he murmured. "But guilt. Guilt is waterborne. It floats. It clings to the surface, no matter how deep one tries to bury it." I said nothing. There was a reverence in his voice that forbade interruption. The room seemed heavier somehow, as though the fire had not destroyed evidence, but laid to rest a ghost. Outside, the bells of midnight chimed across the rooftops. Inside, a silence remained, pierced only by the soft hiss of dying ash. In my heart, I knew that Holmes had not solved this case to his satisfaction. But he had ended it in the only way it could be ended, with fire and with restraint. Some weeks later, as spring returned to London with hesitant sunlight and streets slick with thawing frost, I found Holmes in Regent's Park, seated on a bench, his gaze distant. We spoke little that morning. The case, though closed in action, lingered in the mind like a mournful chord unresolved. At last, I asked him the question that had troubled me. "Do you believe Reuben Harwood was murdered?" Holmes gave no immediate reply. He plucked a leaf from the bench beside him, turning it over absently in his fingers. Then, in a voice touched not with certainty, but with something more rare, compassion, he said, "A sailor vanished, yes, but perhaps it was only the man he had become that disappeared. The rest had been missing for years." And in that single utterance, he closed the matter more completely than any tribunal could. There was no need for gallows, nor ink-stained judgments. There was only the truth, quiet and sorrowful, that sometimes men are lost not to crime, but to time, to grief, to the terrible weight of unspoken guilt. We walked on in silence, and though the case of the Barrow Queen was never published, never celebrated, never even named in the records of Scotland Yard, it remains, among all our adventures, the one that taught me how justice sometimes arrives not with arrest, but with understanding, and how some endings are not solved, but born. As we turned from the river, the chill dampness, clinging to our coats, Holmes lit a fresh cigarette, his gaze distant yet sharp. "Do you know, Watson," he murmured, "the most persistent evidence is not found in ledgers or testimonies, but in what people choose to live with. Eleanor carried her guilt not to evade justice, but to rewrite a truth buried by law and silence." He paused, watching the faint ripples below the bridge. The law punishes what it can see, but the conscience, it punishes what it knows. What do you believe was Eleanor's true motive? Love, guilt, or revenge? And was it justice she sought, or something far more personal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story intrigued you, subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries and pass it along to a fellow sleuth who might follow the clues just as keenly.